It is such an honor to be on the stage today, to be sharing the stage with my idol, a person without whose book, The Invention of Women, I would not have written a thing. I would not be sitting here with all of those articles. And I'm supposed to talk and share my point of view, but I actually just want to rush through it so we can get to our conversation. But what I would like to share with you, is my reflection both on what the writing of The Invention of Women meant to me and what I think it's coming even more into its own as a canonical text in light of our current efforts to grapple with how is it that we know what we know? What have been the political forces that have shaped what we have been told is objective knowledge? And most important, how do we chart a way forward? And for me, when I first read The Invention of Women, I think it came out in 1997, right? So, and that's the year that I finished graduate school. And I was sitting with trying to wrap my head around what is it that I really wanted to say. So Bringing the Empire Home was still in dissertation form. And what I was really struggling with at the time was there was a whole move afoot to suggest that people of African descent in general and women of African descent in particular had a problem. And that problem was that we were something called essentialists. What this whole move to characterize a whole body of work, so I'm talking about people who were writing at the time like Angela Davis, people who were writing like, Bell Hooks was the reigning queen at the time, that there was kind of a counter move to suggest, well, and again, we're talking in an era where everything was postmodern, post-colonial, post-structural. So there was a way in which there was a bit of a backlash against what Black feminists were trying to do, which was to try to talk about the knowledge that we have been given is inadequate to explain our circumstance. And what we were being told by persons who were more powerful or more well-known in the academy than we was, in this moment of post-structuralism and post-colonialism and postmodernism, what you people are doing is backward. You are now telling us that there is something called a privileged position of Black womanhood. Or you are trying to say that there's something like an essential Black woman. And they're saying to us, you are being as bad as the people that you critique because you are suggesting that there's something essential and different about what your experience has been or what you want to say. In other words, you are as racist as they. You are the ones who are now centralizing the race that we wish to deconstruct. So I'm sitting there with a knowledge, with a feeling that what I was reading was deeply unsatisfying, and suddenly having the vocabulary that I was just learning to use really being taken away, being told that that is not the way in which one does critical scholarship. And then along came a book like The Invention of Women. And what that book meant for me was it allowed me to do, and for a moment I'm going to compare you to Durkheim, of all people, and Durkheim's notion of taking social facts as things. And what Durkheim says when you take a social fact as a thing is, first of all, it is not about what the thing is, it is about an attitude of mind in which you approach it. And you approach it with an attitude of utter indifference. Your indifference allows you to examine, what is this thing? Does it exist outside of the mental constructs that I myself am imposing upon this thing? And so what The Invention of Women, for me, allowed me to do was to begin to think about this notion of woman and gender itself, which was one of the foundational categories of analysis that one was using, as something that was not abstract, universal, given, but something that was in many deeply ways a colonialist construct. And the way in which it was asserted was not simply for me to just simply say, well, these things are Western and therefore we mustn't use them or can't use them, but to deeply problematize the concept. And from then, with that knowledge, for me, it really opened up an entire world of how to approach the project of making knowledge adequate for the current circumstances, adequate for the circumstances that I wish to explain. And so for me, as we sit in this moment of great angst, this moment of great difficulty, this moment that has a tremendous amount of pain and strife, but also a moment of tremendous possibility, where the question is finally on the table of how to ask questions about concepts that have been given to us as universal, and how to truly decenter both the West and all of the epistemological baggage that has come along with being a colonized people. And to suggest, again, in a moment where, as we are living in a post-structuralist, post-modern, post-colonial, in the United States we have the great pleasure to be now living in a moment that is being called post-racial. And to have a set of tools by which to grapple with how does one enter into a critique when the very grounds of critique are suddenly being pulled out from under us. To speak of race is to suddenly be known as racist. And so therefore, what a concept of decolonization is deeply important in a moment where transformative politics, at least from where we sit in the United States, have been transformed and depoliticized into something called diversity. And so again, that language of being able to enter into this conversation with this notion of rupture, and with not only a notion of rupture, it is one thing to take apart, it is quite another thing to rebuild. And what I see, starting again with this very important book, The Invention of Women, and a second iteration, which I can't wait to hear about, where you've gone with your next step of thinking. But this moment of being able to propose this moment of tension and decolonization, this destabilization, as not disabling but productive. And so therefore, really what I would love to do, and this great pleasure I have, and why I consider this such a privilege, is to not only talk about what we are taking apart, which is so deeply important, but what it is that we wish to build intellectually.
Wow. Thank you, Zini, for that. This thing came up again. But can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Following Babawa and Zini, I don't even know where to start. But thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Remember, I was supposed to come in April, but we had to postpone for many reasons. But I'm happy to be here today and to, of course, connect again with Zene. I haven't seen her in a few years. So it's wonderful to be talking to her. And for me, Zene is my sociologist. So when she makes the statement about, you remind me of Durkheim, I said, wow, if Zene says that, then I must wake Durkheim up. And I say that because in my work, in terms of the way I'm regarded in American sociology, they have some difficulty placing me as a sociologist. You know? And why is that so? When I went to the US to study sociology, I remember on my campus at UC Berkeley, whenever I introduced myself to people and said that, well, you know, I'm in sociology, I'm from Nigeria. And they say, but why are you in sociology? I would say, why not? They say, you ought to be in anthropology. And at the time, I wasn't that savvy. I would say, well, why should I be in anthropology? They would say things like, well, you know, sociologists study their own societies, and anthropologists study other societies. They didn't want to tell me point blank that anthropologists study primitive societies. This was Berkeley. People didn't quite do that. So I would say, voila, you see, I am a sociologist. I study my own society. So it sort of confused them. But that was the beginning for me of understanding some of the racial, gendered, cultural biases in the constitution of knowledge when I left Nigeria to go to the US. Another moment for me, and I'm talking about this because it will make you understand how the book Invention came to be written. Another aspect of this was that when I left Nigeria to go to the US to study, I did my first degree in Nigeria. People have told me that in Africa that's important because that a lot of Africans think that we were all minted in the US. No, I did my first degree in Nigeria. I only went to graduate school in the US. So I did not know that there was anything called gender studies. My first degree was actually in political science. And the only reason I decided on sociology for graduate school was because for some reason I wanted to study the family and the impact of colonization on the family. Because in my experience in Nigeria, I saw that many of my friends whose parents were highly Western educated, including their mothers, their family was just different from mine. Even though we're all Yoruba and we spoke Yoruba. So I knew colonization was doing something. So I said, okay, I'll study the family. And I didn't think that political science was receptive to it, and I think I was right. So I applied to study sociology. And so when I got to the US, I discovered this new area called gender studies, women's studies, and my eyes were like, wow. So I registered. One of my first classes in graduate school was a sociology of gender class with Nancy Chodorao. She's one of the biggest sociologists. At that time, she wasn't that big yet, but she was already established. So I would sit in class and people would make all sorts of claims. Women are this, women are that, and that. And I'm scratching my head. Which women are they talking about? Because where I come from, I don't know. I know many kinds of women, but they are not like this. So they would go on. And one of the things that really, really had an impact on me was this idea in feminism. I don't know whether people continue to repeat it. They talk about the fact that because women are oppressed, because women are the subordinated group in society, men don't want to associate with them. So as a result of that, they try to distance themselves by creating categories that are so far apart. Male categories would be so far from women's categories because men just didn't think that they would be associated with women. And so I thought about Yoruba culture. I said, these Yorubas have a problem. Instead of creating separation, what I was seeing was not separation. When I looked at the kinship categories, we don't have a word for brother, we don't have a word for sister, we don't have a word for son, we don't have a word for daughter. The kinship categories we have are non-gender specific. We totally contradicted those things. And when I looked at what might be called traditional occupations in the society, or even the spirituality, the names of the deities, the naming of priest and all, it was just one word. It was not gendered. So I would raise my hand and I'll say, well, the society I come from, it does not fit in, at least at the level of language. And then I don't know whether this happens in South Africa, but many foreign students, African students, have observed this. In the US, you say something in class, and everybody will be quiet for 30 seconds. Then they pick up the conversation as if you never said a word. That happens?
Yeah.
So it went on like that, and I started to shape my ideas about what I would write my dissertation about. But what is interesting is that by the time I had taken more courses, I had been disciplined by the academy. I began to know how to think rather than my loose cannon Nigerian or Yoruba self. I started to think, I imagined, like a sociologist, like somebody in the academy. I said, oh, okay, I'm going to write about gender. But we know that different societies may approach gender categories differently. So I'm going to write about Yoruba society and show the Yoruba version of gender. It didn't occur to me that I could say there was no gender, because I had become, the right thinking. So I wrote my proposal, I was writing, and my professor, my main Africanist professor, because there weren't many Africanists, there was none in my department. So I wrote a proposal that I was going to send for funding, and then he looked at it and said, well, but nobody's going to fund you because you didn't put your work within the context of the literature. I said, I don't see what literature I'm going to put my work in relation to. I said, the literature was not appropriate for Africa, and I didn't want the literature to compromise me. And he just looked at me and just laughed. He said, to be taken seriously, you have to put your work within the context of the literature. So I did. I say all this because I know some of you are also graduate students, that these are ways of shaping you. So I was shaped, and I went to Nigeria. I went to the city of Ibadan, which is a major Yoruba city, to do my so-called field work. So I did this questionnaire in which I said that, well, I want to know how Yoruba people think about gender. I'm going to do a questionnaire. I'm going to do a survey and interviews. And then when I wrote this questionnaire, I wrote it in English. And I had questions like, well, how many children do you have? How many are sons? How many are daughters? And then when I started reading it, I said, oh my gosh, Yorubas have no word for son. They have no word for daughter. I was putting words in their mouth. That was my epiphany. That was my epiphany. So I said, why am I writing this questionnaire in English? I speak Yoruba. I am Yoruba. The people I'm going to talk to, some spoke English, but many of them were sellers in the market. But why was I privileging English? And I started to see how the language in and of itself was compromising me. And it was at that point that I began to understand the meaning of positivistic knowledge, right? Because indeed, it was not about me going out there and making observation. There are 5 people in the room. How do I know there are 5 people in the room? That's an interesting question. For a Yoruba spiritualist, you don't know that. and indeed, you are laughing because there's one section of Invention of Women in which a major historian, if I mentioned his name, you all know him, and he's a Yoruba historian. He talks about how the marketplace in Yoruba land is women's space par excellence. And I said, but how does he know that? Because the marketplace is at the crossroads. And and spiritually, there are all these ideas that that's where all sorts of creatures meet. I said, so he So I knew that at that point, I knew I had to go beyond ideas about just observing. I had to go into philosophical discourses. I had to look at the philosophy of language. I had to look at categories. I had to look at world sense, not just world view. And it was then that it became clear to me what I had to do. And that's the beginning of the real story of the invention of women.
Incredible. So, can we transition a bit into your next project with its extremely provocative name? What gender is motherhood?
Yes.
And can you explain to us both how does this build upon what you did in the invention of woman, in the invention, and why motherhood?
Good question, Zini. Perhaps I should remind you, or maybe you all never knew this. Does anybody know the title of my dissertation? It was called Mothers Not Women. Making sense of Western discourses of gender. Mothers Not Women. So as soon as I got to graduate school and I was ruminating on those categories, I was ruminating on what I saw as the exaggeration of gender. One thing that became clear to me, and it's not just me, it's just that I'm taking it from another angle. Many of us, scholars from non-Western societies, always felt that feminism did not do right by motherhood. Or, to put it in another way, that maybe they really don't get motherhood, at least the way we thought we got it. Although sometimes when I start talking about motherhood in Yoruba society, I'll have Jewish people stand up in the audience. That's a Jewish mother. That's an Italian mother. Then I say, well, I don't see that in feminism, you know? So I always felt that another big thing that one had to deal with in terms of how feminism was talking about women, was the whole issue of motherhood. I felt that motherhood was big. I felt that motherhood in Yoruba society, if you're talking about any kind of categorization, you couldn't go beyond motherhood. And so my dissertation was called Mothers Not Women. I felt that when you talked about the question of power, which ultimately is what feminism is about, in terms of women acquiring power, being empowered, I felt that motherhood in Yoruba society was an empowered, even transcendent position. So when I was writing my dissertation, and if you looked at the dissertation today, there were snippets. I was also writing about motherhood. However, I decided and discovered I could not subsume the ideas of motherhood under women or even gender. There was just too much to deal with in the dissertation. So, in the dissertation, I mentioned motherhood, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to leave much of my research on motherhood alone, because I needed to deal with the category woman. I needed to deal with gender, and said subsequently I would have to address motherhood, which is fundamental even to the invention of women. So I left the whole question of motherhood because I believed that motherhood was not a gendered category. But I couldn't write about it. I didn't have the language. I I was just a little bitty graduate student. I knew it, but I couldn't. You know, invention is going to be 20 years. So it took me so long to get my ideas together in order to be able to make the argument that motherhood is not a gender category. And so by the time I came to this book, I toyed with mothers, not women, which is going back to my dissertation. But one day, what gender is motherhood came to me as a rhetorical question. And the whole essence of what gender is motherhood, for me, if you read the book, chapter 3 really captures what I was trying to say. That in Yoruba culture, motherhood is a transcendent category. It's above everything else, number one. Number two, it is not part of a binary. Fatherhood is not the counterpart of motherhood. And with Yoruba culture and spirituality, it was not difficult. Once I opened my mind to all aspects of the culture, because you would remember that today when we talk about culture, we say religion. But in Yoruba discourses, in reality, people didn't separate spirituality, right, from culture. And to give you a quick snippet of the kind of argument I made to show that motherhood is not a gendered category, I understand gender as a binary. We're trying to get away from the binary. That's fine, all well and good. But by definition, from the Western society it came to us, gender is a binary. So I'm saying that motherhood is not a binary. In Yoruba culture, the relationship between the child and the mother is pre-earthly, gestational, post-gestational, and even in death. The relationship between a child and the father only happens when the child is born. So those two things are not comparable. If you go into Yoruba spirituality, one of the things that we know, and in Yoruba society we all just understand it, is that before each and every one of us, each soul, comes to earth, you see, it's that babies, people are pre-existing in the other world, that we each kneel in front of the Creator to choose our destiny. And my argument, following from that, is that at that point of choosing your destiny, the only other person who is there is mother, is Iya. Because that's the only way you can come to earth. There's no father. And so a whole lot of the way in which Yorubas understand the relationship between mother and child is predicated in that long and deep relationship. One of the ways in which that understanding manifests today in Yoruba land, even the most evangelical Christian Yoruba will find it hard to deny that one of the things we learn is that don't disobey your mother. Because if your mother curses you, it will stick. But the father, what's his problem? You know? So it's all those kinds of issues that made me put forward that argument. And I say that motherhood is not a gender category because the way in which I understood Western ideas of gender is that the female is first and foremost a wife, even before mother. And so the mother is subsumed under wife. And who is the wife? She's subordinated to a father. But in Yoruba culture, and indeed in some other African cultures, right, they will tell you even the king was born of and mother. So you cannot transcend or supersede your mother. That's where I'm coming from.
And I think what is so amazing about what you open up there is you shift the terms of debate when you say that motherhood is not a gendered category. Then we come to ask ourselves not the usual social science question, which is how, for example, you entered your first project of how do these people deviate because they don't do it this way, to a question of decentering what has been at the center and asking, turning to what is now the center and asking, by what means did you become gendered, and what function does it play? So for example, again, writing from a North American context, so you bring up when you have a context where a mother is actually subordinated to being a wife or somebody's daughter. Then, if you are in the North American context, in a particular context of enslavement, what does that make an enslaved African in America who has no natal claim on her own children and no legal right to marry, no legal right to be recognized as a sexually assaulted person, and any number of things that come from that? And then you ask yourself, given again, in the kind of decentering that work does, is you say, then when I am sitting with this category of gender that's come from a particular tradition and having to use it to explain my existence, actually the only thing that I can come away from that is there is only one woman, and that is the woman who is raised as white. That is the only woman who can be legally recognized as a wife. That is the only woman who is not natally alienated from her child. That is the only woman who is legally recognized as rapeable if the person is not her spouse. So therefore we come to not have the very simple way we're sitting is, well, where it becomes, well, all that stuff is just different for black women, or black women have always worked. Or, so again, that space of, this is what is normal and this is how you deviate. And instead you come to be able to be at that space of questioning of how do we get to know what we know? And when we decide that we get to know what we know, that the gendered categories, so for example, the gendered categories in the United States, which we come to understand as biological, were actually, because the enslaved women, they knew, had the same biological capacity. Their entire economic system was predicated on it. So it is not the biological capacity to have sexual intercourse or to produce children. It is rather what is not recognized is the property claim. So therefore, what constitutes gender? What constitutes, why does it make a difference if you are a boy or a girl, for example? Why does it make a difference? The very first case in the United States, the question of the so-called intersexed person was shortly after the English arrived in 1619. And it was a question because one of the settlers, who was, you might say, gender misidentified, wished to make a property claim, wished to collect an inheritance, which persons gendered as female were not allowed to do. Right? So the question of whether a woman of African descent is a true woman becomes a question that is not worth answering because it's not a person who can inherit property. That person is property. So again, all of these questions that are the definition of woman in that context of enslavement was really about a property question. But we come to understand it as a biological question. It becomes abstracted from context, and then many, many years later, this category, which is a category for managing property, we have to write our words about ourselves using these concepts as though they are simply abstracted social science concepts that represent truth. So what again is just so amazing about that disruptive moment of questioning is it allows you to say, this is not the tool I need to do this job. I need a different tool to do this job.
Thank you so much. Very eloquent. And it brought to mind two things. Let me start with what should be the second one. One of the most depressing things, I take motherhood maybe too seriously, but motherhood is serious. Because as I always say, without motherhood, we're toast. There will be no humanity. And remember the first mother? The mother of humanity? Nobuntu, right? I learned that in Bulawayo. That mother of humanity, Nobuntu, was an African woman. I'm glad she didn't have an abortion. Anyway, so I don't take motherhood seriously. And one of the most disturbing things I ever read, maybe in the last 5 years, was in the work of it's a feminist scholar. She's at UPenn now. She does, I forget her name. But I was surprised to find that in the 19th century, in the southern United States, when slaveholders, when they bequeath their enslaved people to their children, right? And that's one way in which African families, black families were scattered, right? Because, this person died, one daughter married there, another married 2 million miles away, and so they just scattered. But this particular slaveholder was a woman, a white woman. And what was so different for me and fascinating and disturbing was that she had a number of children, and she had a young black enslaved girl, maybe not even a teenager yet. So she gave this child to one of her children, and then gave the children, the unborn, the potential children that this teenager was going to have, to another of her children. How do you do that? And she was a woman. So she's assuming this teenager is going to be a mother at some point. She's not pregnant, but she's already planned. And so when we talk about sisterhood and female solidarity, I always think of that. And how do we begin to understand? How are we all going to be this woman category when, So it really gets me thinking, especially in relation to what Zini has just said. The other moment that I was just thinking about today is that you probably have heard of Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was an abolitionist. Unfortunately, we have images of her. In the 1860s, I think, in the US, when white women were fighting for the vote, and they had one of their meetings at Seneca Falls in New York. It was white women. There were few black women, and Sojourner Truth was one of them. And they said when she came into the room, there were men there. People were saying that she's not a woman. I don't know whether you've seen the image of Sojourner Truth. She's a strong African woman, and she had her head wrapped. And they said many of them was a raucous. And many people were saying, she's not a woman. The men were saying that she's not a woman. And that's why when she gave that Ain't I a Woman speech. If you've never read it, and she talked about how she has had 9 or 10 children, and she could plow fields which no man can plow. At that conference, Sojourner Truth bared her breast. I imagine she took off her clothes and said, look at me, I am a woman. She showed her breast. Interesting, the way we want to read those things, especially in the light of bearing breast, the meanings of it across continents, across ages, and across cultures. And indeed, her question continues to resonate. Ain't I a woman? Or who is a woman? And where's woman the category? Anyway.
And then that point that you made about one woman being promised, the word that they used was increase, right? And it became, if we want to think, intersectionally, it is an example about how some women can exert their independence by dominating other women.
Yeah.
So if a father wanted to make sure that his daughter went into a marriage with her own property, like a very important ground upon which white women fought was the right to control their own property. And a very important piece of property was that increase. It was a way for a white father to bequeath property that he did not yet have, property in the future. So then when we think intersectionally, we think that some people are made out of other people. So in fact, again, colloquially, what slave owners would say to their slaves were things like, if you don't cooperate, I'm going to put you in my pocket, meaning that I'm going to sell you to do something else. People talk, there's a historian, Walter Johnson, who's written an amazing book called Soul by Soul, Life in the Antebellum Slave Market, where he literally talks about the ways in which slaves were a way to constitute white families. That it was a unique type of property that expanded, and it expanded through our bodies. And so when thinking intersectionally, it is one of those really important epistemological breakthroughs that kind of, begins as an effort to move from a triple oppression type of approach and starts to think about how the categories constitute one another. And it opens up a whole nother, again, when you bring intersectionality with decolonization, to me that is, again, one of these very fruitful moments where you both begin to think how oppressions intersect, but also you begin to think about the fact that I actually cannot think what masculinity or femininity is without thinking that these are deeply raced concepts. I can then, why are they raced? It's a property question. So instead of this, is race more important than class? This kind of abstract empiricism that strips these questions of power out of these and gives them back to you as variables. What intersectionality and decolonization can do brought together is to bring back those questions of power, and also, which is so important, think that you actually cannot have one of these categories without the other. And trying to analyze them by abstracting them from each other as variables inevitably brings you to the dead-end conversations that we have arrived at, or at least that American social science has arrived at. And again, it's only by that deep historicization, not deep historicization one, but also you've got to look other places in order to think differently. In order to have an entryway into thinking there's societies or places or traditions that do it differently. Because I loved how you start the second book, where, or I'll let you tell the story, where you're sitting on the stage, and where you were in Vermont.
Yes, I think that's a part that we should read. That's why I wanted
Yes.
the book.
Okay.
So, yes.
And then we can open it up.
We
'cause
can
it's
open it up.
Fantastic.
Yes, so she said 5 minutes, you use 3, I'll just use 2.
Okay, very egalitarian.
To talk. So I just want to say something. I've been in South Africa since August last year. So about 9 months now. And the most gratifying thing for me was the way in which young people like you have responded to my work. I was just surprised at the extent of my work that people knew. Sometimes I would forget something. Somebody said, "Oh, do you remember that paper you said this?" Oh my God. I'm in big trouble. Which is gratifying to see that you have ideas that people can take forward. You know? Even if people take it and critique you, they are taking it forward. That is so important to me. The other part that I have also been happy about is the whole discourse of decolonial and decolonizing, right? And the way in which I see the whole discourse of decolonizing knowledge, the academy, and everything else, part of what it does for me is to show another way in which my work is so relevant. Because at a certain level, the colonizing means endogenizing, looking inwards, localizing. It's not something about a throwback to the past. It's about we have to think from where we're standing, right? And then, of course, when Africans start talking about the past, people say, "Oh, it's a throwback." Do you know that when Europeans, in the 19th century, when Europeans wanted to reconstitute themselves, at least the people called themselves Europeans, do you know what they did? They went back into Greek history, ancient history. Have you ever seen anybody accusing them of a throwback? In fact, over the years, I am angry on behalf of the Greeks. Because Northern Europeans colonized Greek history. They colonized Greek history. And you remember with all this crisis going on, when they talk about the Greeks, you think that they came from my hometown in West Africa. You remember? The same Greeks that you have colonized. And then I'm always worried for the Yoruba deities. Because they'll just render them useless. The way in which the Greek gods have become some literary. That was their religion, man. But when Europe took the Greeks over, and you have to wonder, what is the relationship between Norway and Greece? And then, of course, all these kinds of discussion comes out of the fact that the Greeks borrowed a lot from Egypt. And that's where the action is. So, in terms of my work and endogeneity, I'm happy that we're decolonizing. But not enough of us are looking inward at our cultures, at our histories, at the ways in which we thought about things as a way of reconstructing the future. We need to. And I have delved into Yoruba culture. In fact, the most difficult part of my work is delving into Yoruba culture. Although they don't know that in the West. The Western part is easy. I've spent 40-something years studying English. You know, I never studied Yoruba. Not for 1 year, not in a classroom. I have just taught myself now. But fortunately, I speak the language, it's my language. But in terms of academic discourses, right? I have to. So it's a lot of work. This book took me 7 years. But what I hope that my work does is that it will push other Africans to look at where they're standing. That's the local, to look endogenously and say, what's going on here? Let us not just receive concepts and accept concepts. Let us, if we're going to accept the concept, let us build it from the ground up, and when we come up and say, wow, it's exactly how they saw it in Glasgow. But don't start with Glasgow. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. And I have found it very fruitful. There are a lot of things we can talk about. I'll stop there because you can ask questions. And I'll look for that little passage. Yes.
Wow. Thank you so much, Prof. Magubane and Prof. Oyewumi.